Hello, friends. Tonight's episode is going to blow your mind. It blew my mind. It's still monsoon season here, so forgive the rain and the thunder and the lightning. But tonight's episode really made me think so deeply about how we digest information and kind of the dire situation we're in as a country and as a world, with a lack of ability to really critically think and vet sources. We have a special guest tonight, Roger Plothow, and I'll put his information in the description below. So buckle up, buttercups. It's another episode of Topic Discuss. Welcome, viewers. We're here with a special guest star on Topic Discuss, Roger Plothow. And today we're really going to dive into how to vet sources. We talked about this in a critically thinking episode, but I think that Roger has some passions that we also want to hear about. So without further ado, we're going to ask Roger to introduce himself. And Roger, if you tell us a little bit also about your career, starting with journalism.
Sure, Gary. Thank you. I'm glad to talk about this topic. It's an important issue for me. It still drives me. I currently in my day job, I work for a nonprofit organization that develops and promotes registered apprenticeship through the U.S. Department of Labor, and I live in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and we work through the Idaho Department of Labor as well. But I'm a recovering journalist, and that's how I spent most of my career. I was in journalism for 36 years as a reporter, editor, publisher, and I now teach the graduate course in media literacy at Gonzaga University, which is, of course, one of the finest universities in all of America, and also plays a little basketball. And I also teach a course in fundamentals of oral communication at College of Eastern Idaho, which is the community college here in Idaho Falls. But my real kind of driving passion for a long time has been the issue of media literacy, particularly in the age of the internet and the age of social media. It's a topic, I think, that is actually one of the two or three most important issues of our time, and it's frightening where we're at. And so I just really take every opportunity I can to help people try to appreciate and understand what media literacy is all about. In the last full year I was a newspaper publisher, I wrote one column a week for a year on nothing but news and media literacy, because I really believe that's what it took to get the issue out and explained to the readers and viewers of the newspaper. So I think it's just something that if we don't pay enough attention to it, if we aren't aware of the risks associated with the current media environment, there's real trouble. In fact, the trouble is here. We are in some dire straits.
Yeah. So Roger, just this is exactly what we want to talk about. So I love what you said, and I want to take some time to dive into that. You mentioned that you are worried that we're in a dire straits now in terms of media literacy and critically thinking. Why do you make that assessment?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, and I spend a full semester going through this in my media literacy course at Gonzaga. So this is going to be a really condensed. I'm an old guy. I'll be 63 soon. I recall there was a time, and I don't want to sound like that guy, okay, boomer, but there was a time in the 60s, 70s where journalism was sort of an understood. We knew what it was, and if you were reading newspapers or if you were watching TV news, there was a general understanding of what that meant. One of the things that the internet has done, for better and for worse, but in this case for worse, is made it easy for anybody to become a journalist. And so we've had this. It started with cable. So going back to the launch of CNN back in 1980, and from there, it became relatively inexpensive to launch any kind of medium. And with the internet, it became essentially free. And so everybody who thinks they have a voice is now engaging in what they want to call the news business. Well, news is a thing. Journalism is a thing. The Society of Professional Journalists defines what journalism is. And probably, I mean, you can go through, and I include CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. That's most of what's going on there has nothing to do with journalism whatsoever. And it's increasingly true of TV news and, sadly, in the newspaper business. We have lost what the whole purpose of journalism was, and it's sort of been from the inside out to a certain degree. What happens?
Just to make a comment there, my father and my mother, they're in their late 70s. And I can remember during the whole Trump presidency, and specifically around, the issues around Donald Trump, right? That he had several bankruptcies, he has the pretty, dark and nefarious background, and also just what was being pumped out by Fox News that my parents watch. What I noticed that they would do is they just relied on that one news source. And I finally had a conversation with my dad and said, look, Dad, I can't even have a dialogue with you about climate change, right? When there is scientific evidence around it, what happened? Why is your only news source Fox News? And he said, well, Gary, I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know what to believe anymore because growing up, I had the Encyclopedia Britannica that sat on a shelf, and then I had Walter Cronkite.
So that's exactly the example, Gary, is there was a time when our choices were limited, but they were sort of self-vetting. So, encyclopedia was reliable. And Walter Cronkite and Brinkley and Huntley and those they were committed to doing journalism. And so you could sort of just watch it and read it and essentially rely on it. Now there wasn't, if you go back to a period, say in the 30s and 40s, that during the era of yellow journalism, newspapers were propped up based on politics as much as anything else. So journalism is particularly as defined by the Society of Professional Journalists, is a fairly new idea. And it had a fairly short lifespan, apparently. Less than 100 years. So now the issue is, and you've captured it perfectly, is you can't just pick one and listen and read it and assume you've got it. But where do you go? Because it now requires significant effort. You can't just be a passive consumer. That does not work anymore. And probably to a degree it never did work, but it's becoming far more critical that we do our own vetting, that we understand the process, that we understand how these things come about. Well, what we know is Fox News is the prime example. It's not the only one. Has a target audience, and it's going to play to that target audience just like the same politicians are going to play to that core audience. And they're going to stay only within a certain set of parameters. And anything that strays beyond that, they're not going to get there. They're not going to go there. I have the same conversations with folks who use one or two sources, and so in a just a basic conversation, I had this experience over the weekend in having some conversations with family, and a couple of times I stopped and said, well, that's not true. Well, that's a bad thing to say in a conversation, chatting around the family room. That's, you don't want to be doing that. And I come across as arrogant and, holier than thou and all that kind of stuff. But the fact is, at what point do you just stop and say, wait, just what you've just said is factually, demonstrably not true. And here's an example of one of those conversations. There was a conversation about, in San Francisco, you can go into any store and shoplift up to $950 and walk away, and no one's ever going to arrest you. This is out there. Yeah. And in fact, it was mentioned in a column in the New York Times by the West Coast bureau chief of the New York Times. It's demonstrably, factually not true. There is data that goes back 7 years tracking this type of crime. It has not increased in the state of California in that period. It is simply not true. Now, can you find anecdotal evidence? Can you find instances in which these things happen? Of course you can. You can find anything you want. But this is one of the lessons of media literacy, is find the data. Find something that has gone beyond anecdotes, beyond one or two instances, beyond a narrative or a story, into research. Well, the problem is, who wants to do that? Who wants to be in college all the time? So we have this really heavy lift because so few outlets are doing it for us now that we have to go do it ourselves. And this is my fear, Gary, is that if you expect people to do their own vetting, it's mostly not going to happen. And so we're going to get to the usual suspects, the audience that is predisposed to doing this, to trying to figure it out. It's a pretty small number. It's a pretty, right. It's the kind of students that I teach in graduate school, but mostly people don't want to work that hard.
So, that's the thing that I love about what we're doing with this channel, is I think that we want to have a how-to critically think kind of motif, and help people know that the work that you can put into doing that, to vetting of source or understanding media literacy, can be enjoyable and actually fulfilling, right? It leads to enlightenment, and that's enriching. But I agree with you. There is this, and I've been saying on a couple of my other episodes, I feel like people are kind of lazy. And I think that's probably not good for me to say either, because it sounds arrogant, right? But Brad said something on a previous episode. Brad is your son, for those who have watched Brad and I talk about critical race theory. Brad said something really interesting. He said, if the data's found you, that's a red flag. And did he get that phrase from you, by the way?
He didn't.
I wonder, but
because that's more articulate than I would have put it. But it's a true statement. If again, this comes back to the passive consumption of content. If you are passively consuming content, you are probably in big trouble already. If you're just waiting for it to come to you, you can assume that whoever is sending it to you has a reason to put it out to you, and it's not necessarily in your best interests. So, for one thing, we have to be active consumers of information, and there are some simple steps to getting 80% of the way there. It doesn't have to be something that you spend all day doing, and it can be selective. But the first thing you have to do is know that when you're engaging on the internet or on social media, that you are swimming in the sewer, and act accordingly. And there is there's more bad stuff than good stuff out there, and somehow you've got to start being selective and being more active in the
Is
process.
that true? Would you say that's true for cable? Some of my viewers are cable, consumers, cable news.
Here's what I would ask people, Gary. So it's the same test I ask people to engage in when they're going to a website. What are the values of the source? What do they express? If you go dig in, how are they funded? What's their purpose? Who are they? What kind of do they ask you to put them to the test? Do they say, here's our value proposition and hold us to it? And here's what I would say to basically all of the cable news, which it's not, but for the sake of conversation, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, you can go on, is no. They aren't there to provide journalism. They are there to attract an audience. And here's the great thing from the business perspective. If you're like Fox News, people think Fox News has 80 million viewers. No, it has 2 or 3 million. At the top of on their hottest night, they're at maybe 3 million. That's all it takes to make a whole bunch of money, because what they're doing is cheap. Why? Because they don't have any boots on the street. It's a person sitting in a studio and asking other people to come to the studio and yell at each other, or they're yelling at you, and they're saying what you want to hear, and you are self-selecting that you are in sync with them, and they have to stay within those parameters. And that is a recipe for tribalism and all of the cliches that you can throw at it. But it's, one of the true things about a cliche is they tend to be true. They tend to be based in truth. And so here we are. And it's, I think Fox is the worst example, frankly. I mean, and I think it's just based on any set of data you want to follow as far as tracking the factuality of their reporting or their whatever it is they do. But CNN has its own issues for sure. You get into the prime time of CNN, and they're not doing journalism. They're yelling at you. It may be gentler, and it may be skewed more to the left, perhaps. MSNBC goes a little farther left. But so no, cable is frankly no better than a lot of websites. But the good news is, if you are selective and if you are looking, you can find on the internet some fairly useful and journalism-based places to go.
So could we use an example? Could I throw an example at you and see if you could walk us through? Because
Sure.
I have an example from a viewer. I actually have a couple, but one I want to start with because it relates to our most recent episode was about critical race theory, and I also have a probably, I don't know, 50% of my audience that are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're either really conservative Mormons or they're progressive, or maybe they're post. But two of my viewers who were kind of arguing about with each other over social media about race and racism, and the fact that racism existed in our church, in this predominant religion in Utah. And one of the viewers said, "No, the church was never racist, right?" And comes up with all these apologetic reasons why there was segregation in any church. And she began to cite things like, Candace, I think, is an African American woman who shows up on Fox News once in a while and says, no, racism never really did exist, or if it did, it's in the past, so we need to forget about it. And so this viewer continues to surround herself in the sewer, I think you're saying, where, all that comes on her social media feed is stuff confirming her bias. So for someone like her, and any of us, because every one of us watching right now has a bias, and we feel good when the bias is confirmed, right? And so how would that viewer who has a view that, racism hasn't really been an issue, the predominant religion was not really racist, that none of that's true, and redistricting never happened, right? And we don't have a problem now with institutionalized racism. How would someone like her take steps to vet the media that's coming in front of her and those sources?
Okay, so the first issue, as you know, is the willingness to do so. You talk about confirmational bias. We all engage in it to one degree or another because it's our comfort level. And so the first thing is that people have to be willing to question their own fundamental beliefs. Well, that's a really tough thing. So you talk about Mormons, I'm post, but very fond of, I wouldn't change anything. In 1978, I was on a mission in Hong Kong when we got the call that African Americans, black males had been allowed to hold the priesthood. Well, this was cause for great celebration for all the obvious reasons. But to say that that the policy prior to 1978 was not racist belies the basic facts of the circumstance. And you can go at it however you want, but if you go back and really go into the history, really take the time to read it. When I was at BYU way back in the day, I had a professor named Mike Quinn who wrote a number of books about really amazing books about Mormon history. And of course, he got sideways with a lot of folks, including Elder Packer at the time.
You knew Michael Quinn?
I did know Mike Quinn, yeah.
Then we have a lot we can talk about. This is cool. Keep
absolutely going. The best professor at BYU at the time, and the genius in research, and probably a little naive in his belief that it would all be okay. But yeah, I took two courses from him at BYU. Great guy. At any rate, here let me leap forward. Here's one challenge. We're talking about race specifically, and I'm making this challenge to anybody who will listen. Read the book Caste, Caste. Read that book, and then let's have a chat. Caste is a book about American racism and its 300 and some odd year history. And it's not, I mean, yes, does it have anecdotes? Yes, but it's based on data. It's based on facts. It's based on research. And it compares American racism to the caste system in India and to Nazi Germany. And the main difference is we continue to convince ourselves that not only are we not racist now, but we never were. And it's utter fiction. And it's a fiction today. And And there is reason to believe that the election of Donald Trump was a complete reaction to the election of Barack Obama. It was the endangered white class that was reacting to a deep seated, very very deep fear that their world was being changed, and that's a scary thing. So but the question you ask is, I mean, is as much about style as substance. How do you have a conversation with someone? You can't, you can't do what I tend to do. Well, you're just wrong. That's not helpful. No one's going to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, you're probably right. I'm just wrong. That's never going to happen. And so, how we go about it, and maybe trying to gently, like I say, I had friends back in the day when I was growing up who were not Mormons, they would say, I tell you what, if you'll go to my church once, I'll go to your church once. If you'll read the book Cast, I'll read whatever a book that you want me to read, straight across, and then we'll compare notes. We'll have it.
I like that.
We'll have a chat about what we discovered, and maybe because we have to be willing to push ourselves as well, go into so I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, but I believe that thoughtful conservatism is vital to our country, that you need to have this pool of ideas. We don't want a country full of progressives. That would be bad, because we need this marketplace of ideas. We all of us need to be willing to put ourselves out there and have these conversations and engage in the process of learning things that we don't know about or that make us uncomfortable, and then trying to honestly evaluate what we've come up with. And every experience like that, I believe, changes us just a little bit. And even in ways that are very subtle, but it changes our worldview even just a little bit, and that's healthy. That's when we get to the point where we think we've got everything all figured out. That's where we're in the gravest danger.
So, could I add? Maybe this is more. If this is too personal, just let me know. I think one way that we can also help people through that process is through stories, and you and I, I'm also a member of the Mormon Church, and I've experienced my own faith journey, which I can talk about later. But for you, can you share a story where you came across data and information for yourself that caused you to have some cognitive dissonance, and rather than kind of making some story up, but to make sense of it, you actually did do some data discovery and actually did vet your resources? And how did you personally work through, because the cognitive dissonance is painful for people, right? For somebody to think, oh, I really loved President Ezra Taft Benson, and for me to come along and say, yeah, and he was a racist, and he was blatantly racist, and we can find that data. Some of my viewers right now will feel their heart hurt when they hear me say that. Do you have a personal experience of how you worked through that?
Goes back to Mike Quinn and one of the books he did on the magic worldview. And if anyone wants to look it up, it's probably still out there. But so Mike, who was a professor at BYU in history and really, again, a genius researcher and painstaking. He spent days going through the Mormon archives and hanging out in the vaults and all of the stuff you have to do if you're going to be a real researcher. And so he wrote about the factual and really not debatable history of Joseph Smith. And he connected it to the magic worldview of the day, of his time. Well, that had a profound impact on me, and I'm a fifth generation Mormon. I grew up. But I grew up initially in Indiana, and so I wasn't a Utah Mormon, but I was a fifth generation for reasons that we never quite understood. Our family never went to Utah until 1970. But and so that was, and I was fresh out of returning from a mission, and recently married in the temple and all that stuff. But it was sort of a part of it. And I read Hugh Nibley when I was young. So
Me
and
too.
and his daughter Becky and I were in the same class at Provo High back in the day, and so I read Nibley, and I found him to be very provocative. And of course, he was a staunch defender of the Book of Mormon in particular. Used his ability to speak 11 languages to really kind of shame anybody else who wanted to challenge him. But he was also a liberal progressive thinker. And he wrote about education policy and things. And he really started to shape my desire to think critically, to not just accept. Well, the process you caught up, and I wrote for a time for Sunstone back in the day. Sunstone
Oh,
is
you
and
did.
was, yeah. You can go find a couple of my articles, and I engaged with. I knew the editor and knew some of the people who were writing, and I sort of engaged in that and dialogue, which was a quarterly academic approach to Mormon faith. But and I remember at one point reading an article, a paper in dialogue called "At Home at Sea." I don't remember who it was, and I convinced myself that I was at sea. I was confused and trying to figure this out, but I was going to be at home there. Well, I am, but what at sea means to me now is different than it used to be. I am willing to say I don't know, but my former beliefs don't fit with my current value system. Um, so, but it was painful. It was a 15-year process. It was it's like losing a member of the family. It's like cutting off a limb. I understand why people who struggle with it let it go. Just don't engage it anymore. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm just going to stay, or I'm going to do what it is, but I'm going to just put it aside. I understand that. And to take it to a broader extent, I understand the same inclination of people who don't want their political views upset, or their worldview upset in some
Right.
way,
Right.
because it's where they're comfortable. It's what and it's hard. It's really difficult when you start confronting the dissonance of what critical thinking requires of you. But
Because oh, go ahead. You go ahead.
well, I'm just saying but it also has its own rewards, and you've got to be willing to know what those are and recognize them and then embrace them.
Yeah, because I, the reason I asked you that question, and thank you so much for sharing it, is I believe that part of the reason people struggle with media literacy, vetting sources, is because the process of vetting a source, number one, it takes work, right? You can't just take the data that's fed to you over a YouTube or Facebook or whatever. But secondarily, sometimes you find out information that does not confirm your bias and actually indicates you are wrong. And for some people, that means you've been wrong for a lifetime.
Well, and for everybody, that isn't simple. It's not. Let's not pretend that we all just can do this and it's okay. It's not. It's hard. And to say to someone, "Oh, come on, just grow up and be a grown up and deal with it." That's not fair. It's hard. So the first thing I would say to anybody is, it's a deep effort, and there's a psyche change that has to kind of take place to be willing to do it. So I interrupted you, but it's just, this is not easy.
No, I'm glad that you spoke up, because it really, what viewers want to hear are people besides me, yourself, and really your experience and background. So thank you. And uh, so if you were to think of the viewers as maybe a class, what are some key principles you would teach regarding is it media literacy, or what do we call vetting a source?
So media literacy is the broad category, of course. So we were talking about everything from social media to music and broadcast and all of the things that make up media. When we get down to now, what we're talking about is vetting sources for information. I call that news media or news literacy. So we're narrowing the field to just what purports to be a news source, and is it a good source? And again, the first thing I ask anyone, and let's focus for a moment on the internet. When you go to the About tab on any page, for one thing, is it there? Is there an About tab there? If it's not, run away.
So an About tab on a website, but there's also About tabs on Facebook pages and YouTube pages, right?
Yeah, and so what you want to know is, what are they saying about themselves? What does this source or this person or this whatever say about themselves? And if they're not telling you anything, run away. Second, if they're not giving you a full picture, for example, if it's a place that's purporting to be a news source, how are they funded? What do they have journalism standards? And if so, what are they? Do they offer you to challenge them on what they're are they living up to their values? Let me give you an example of, and I don't want to hold myself up as the perfect way to do this, but when I was a newspaper publisher, and so I started when before the internet, but as we evolved into the internet and we built our web pages, one of the things I insisted on was doing the same thing we did in the print pages, which was creating an About tab that said, here's who we are, here's who owns us, these are our policies, our standards, here's how to get hold of me, here's how to challenge us if we're not living up to those objectives, those standards. And we basically, what I did in closely working with our editor and others, is we took the Society of Professional Journalism's standards and tweaked them for our purposes, which actually were more stringent. So you knew immediately. And did we always live up to that? No, we made mistakes. And one of the basic fundamental premises of journalism that we espoused was, when we make a mistake, we'll tell you and we'll fix it. So if that's not there, and I guarantee you on 95% of these sites, it's not there, just go away. Just understand, or at least understand what it is you're getting, which is you're getting one person's or one group's perspective. And it's going to be skewed, and it's going to be, and it may make you all warm and fuzzy inside. That's also another warning sign. If everything you're reading on a certain place is just completely reinforcing your existing belief system, you are engaging in confirmation bias, and you need to stretch. So and it's very basic. That's not complicated. You don't have to spend a lot of time, but it eliminates a lot of static and a lot of the sewage that we're engaged in, that we're swimming in every time we go into the internet. And there are places where you can go, and this is going to expose one of my biases. There are places you can go that have all of that stuff there, and they tend to be newspaper sites. because that's sort of just the culture. And so you can go on there and you can they'll tell you how they go about doing their business. It's becoming less true than it used to be, unfortunately, because newspapers aren't making the kind of money they once did, and they're trying to figure out how to fix that.
So for news, so if some of our viewers could do this actually right now if they wanted to, they could say, okay, well, I like NPR. So I'm going to go to NPR and find out, on an article I've read where their source is from. Um, and I think the other thing that you've said is they would be not only open to peer review, but inviting peer review, which means you will invite your critics.
They will
Is that
seek
fair
it
to say?
out. They
Yeah.
will be proactive, not just they'll take it when it comes, but they will seek it out. That's serious journalism, and frankly, NPR does that. And you'll hear when you listen to an NPR story, if the story involves one of their major funders, they will tell you. So if they're doing a piece on Amazon, they will say either as part of the story or at the end, Amazon is a major contributor to
Yeah.
NPR. That's an important piece of information to know.
We do the same thing in scientific research, right? We have to disclaim conflicts of interest. We have to disclaim if we are funded by a pharmaceutical company. So it's a very similar, really, it's a scientific process you're identifying.
If the scientific process you're following is here's one of the issues in academia. Not everybody's doing that, and there have been as you know, there have been significant issues in research, and so one of one of the debates that we have in my media literacy class is, okay, if you're going to do a paper or you're going to do a project, and I want you to rely on academic sources, does that mean that everything you're going to do is going to be pure and accurate? Because it's based on academic sources that were peer reviewed. Answer is not necessarily. And here's a question that is ongoing in my class. Wikipedia, is it a good source or not? Well, it depends on what you're looking for, but in some ways Wikipedia may be better peer reviewed than a lot of research papers are. If you get into, I read a lot of academic journals. We want to believe that if it's been peer reviewed and it's in an academic journal, that it's good. It's good research. That is not always true, and it's been demonstrated time and again that someone didn't divulge their funding source, or they misinterpreted data, either intentionally or not. And so. And one of the reactions to someone listening to this might be, okay, I give up. I can't get there.
Yep.
That's not the right answer. The effort will pay off. The effort will pay off. Just be aware. Take a little more critical approach. You talk about critical thinking. This is essential to everybody. In my freshman course on fundamentals of oral communication, I do a week on critical thinking before we do anything else. We talk about what it means to approach any topic critically, because that is a skill they will use the rest of their lives if they can even get a little picture of it. They will benefit by that. And so I start with that, and then I do a week on media literacy, because part of being able to communicate is understanding what you're consuming.
I think that so when I go back to my story about my own father, and he, by the way, he was willing to read a Nature article with me about climate change and how you can see effects of climate change in a tree. You can actually see how climate has changed over time in an old tree stump. If you go hiking, in national forests, you can actually see where, there have been changes in climate, and none of those changes have been as significant as they have been since, human intervention, anthropomorphic or anthropologic intervention. So so I'm just going to shout that out to my dad, because I don't mean to say he had, but he told me he was worried and scared and didn't know what to believe. And so and then I have other family members and friends who I know they'll never change their worldview.
Mhm.
They are set in it. So I think we have a future generation, right? I know we do. My children, your children, the people that you teach, that are at universities. So for the parents that are watching, I believe that our future generation of children will not survive, economically, I think. And also, I think even with their own mental health, without these skills, because the future is information, and information, uh, 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 data mining and understanding and parsing out what data is sewer and what data is gold. I like your sewage example, because our children are so bombarded with data and information beyond anything I could have comprehended as a kid, which is like a river of sewage. So what data is valuable that we want to mine? Where's the gold? So if you were to give one or two or three principles to the parents that are listening, that need to help their children navigate this data and information, what are the two or three principles you'd highlight for critical teaching critical thinking?
So before I just forgive me, before I do that, let me
Yeah.
just go back to something you just said, because I believe the threat is more existential than even surviving economically. I believe it's surviving, period. And here are two examples. Something like 40+% of our country does not believe that vaccination is important in a time of a worldwide pandemic. That's not an economic, that's survival. That is literally, and we're going to see it coming back now,
Mm-hmm.
unnecessarily.
Yep.
Nearly half of a significant minority of our country believes the 2020 election was not legitimate. That's not, that's an existential, fundamental crisis where that many people can actually believe something that is demonstrably false. So, and I did some of this, and you can ask Brad to verify this, but one of the things that I think is so basic in a family is when you're having a conversation at the dinner table, just as a basic part of being a family, and someone brings something up, gently but with purpose, say, so let's talk about that for a minute. So where did you hear that? And it's frightening because we don't want our children to become cynics. At the same time, we want them to start critically thinking at a very early age. And I understand it's fraught with peril because sometimes that same child at 3, if you've taught them to think critically, by the time they're 15, they're thinking critically about you.
Right.
And so now you've created your own monster to a certain degree, but there's a payoff, because in most cases they're going to come back around and they're going to figure this stuff out. It's part of being an adolescent, and you're giving them some tools that they will use for the rest of their lives. And so step one is make it part of every conversation. I think the height of media literacy to me is again, I don't want to put myself out there as the example, but I do not participate on any social media. I am selective in the sources where I go. So yes, do I listen to podcasts? Absolutely. Do I reach out and watch video? And yes, but I select. And I learned about myself ultimately. And I teach a graduate course in media literacy, and I'm not on social media, but I use that as an example. I made that conscious choice because I was engaging in the sewage of the universe here, and it wasn't productive. I tended to get involved in arguments that led nowhere. I tended to consume information that was at best a waste of time. And so again, I would tell my children, and I do tell my children and my grandchildren. When during COVID last year, I did a little lesson with Brad's kids on media literacy. They are not too young to know it, and I did it by Zoom. But I would tell my kids, don't go on Snapchat. You're not going to be on Instagram. You're not, or if you are, we're going to set some very specific limitations to it that that have a purpose, and that purpose may be, chatting with grandma and grandpa, there's a specific purpose to it. But just going on there and spending one of the things that I do with my grad students in the first week is I challenge them to do a 24-hour social media fast. They go off. It just makes them nuts. They can't. I mean, the outrage, and I have them do a little paper on it, just a quick essay. But it's an eye opener to them.
Yeah.
Then try it for a week and see how your life is different and how much time you get back, and how much that stuff. I mean, I start to sound like an old guy again, but that stuff has an effect. It's cumulative, but it's real. And the more time you spend on it, the more potentially harmful it can be. And so, but these are basic ideas that just are part of raising a family, like eating your vegetables. I mean, it ought to be eat your vegetables. What's the source? Where'd you get that story? I think it's just that basic sometimes.
I love the concept of understanding the purpose. So if you have a Facebook account, what is the purpose for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because really Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, these different social media outlets are distribution vehicles. Really, that's all they are. So if you think to yourself, oh, and you're a kid listening, including one of my own kids that I know listens to my channel, if you think I need a Facebook account, I want you to ask yourself, why? Are you distributing a product? If no, then are you distributing a service? Then no. Then you don't need Facebook, right? If you need Facebook because you're launching a political campaign, that makes sense. You're distributing your message. But if it's just casual, like you said, then it doesn't serve a purpose, and bad information will find you. You're basically stepping into the sewer instead of using what the social media platforms are really intended to do, which is distribute your product.
Well, and again, to be cynical, the real purpose of social media is for the owners to make money.
Right.
They don't care about you.
Right.
None of them care about you. They are not going to be there when you are led astray, or you engage in dangerous conversations, or whatever the case might be. They don't care. They are making money, and they're making it hand over fist. So what's their purpose? Understand what their purpose is. Now, can we make productive use of things that are produced by companies that just want to make money? Of course we can. But you have to use discretion, and you have to think critically about it, and you have to ask yourself, what is my end game here? Where is the destination that I want to arrive at? And if this is not helping you get there, then think about that. Figure out what you need, how you need to be changing your approach.
I think about some people that I know who have a Facebook page, and what feeds to them is something about guns, right? So there's also this problem in our country where we're so afraid to talk about gun safety, especially in a state like Utah, where we have a high suicide rate. And we have a very high, one of the highest in the country, death by suicide rate. The death comes from guns. But if we try to talk about gun safety in this state, right, it's like a communist plot. And I have friends and neighbors who will see their Facebook posts, or they'll see a Facebook feed, and they're not realizing the reason that they keep seeing NRA advertisements or people with, guns kill people kill people, not guns, right? These kind of memes. It's because any minute of time you spend on that ad, or that you click, or you just even spend time looking at it, it builds an algorithm that feeds you that same information over and over again.
So you've raised the issue of algorithms, and this is where this gets very dicey, because algorithms allow us to be lazy, and
Yeah.
we think that we are somehow controlling the algorithm and using it to our advantage. No, we are not. So one of the first things I do in my class with students is I have them each go onto Google and Google the exact same phrase, the exact same series of words, and ask them what they get. And each of them gets a different front page.
Right.
Why? Because they are known to the algorithm. And so the algorithm is delivering each of them content specifically designed for what they have, the trace they've left behind on the internet. And so you say you're going to Google it. That means everybody who Googles it is doing something different, and they're doing something that is customized for them. And Facebook is the same, and all of these are the same, because and here's the other problem. There are some nonprofits, well-meaning nonprofits now, that have created algorithms to help you identify unbiased news. Okay, it's garbage in, garbage out. What an algorithm is only as good as the way it's built. And what they have done is they've put their algorithm together based on 4 basic ideas that have nothing to do with facts. It doesn't, and so at the end of the day, you cannot use an algorithm to save you from diving into the sewer. You have to ultimately know how to do it and engage it and be proactive yourself. You cannot rely on well-meaning even other parties to do it for you.
So we're teaching our children, one of the first principles is seriously critically think through or criticize yourself for why do you need a social media account of any kind, number one. And then understanding the purpose can help you shape your experience, right? What is, you were going to mention, I think, 2 more principles in terms of teaching our children about critically thinking and data.
Well, I think you can do this, but so I do believe that we all need to ultimately get beyond the anecdote and the narrative. And this is challenging because we want stories and that's what everybody is doing. So if you go on to any cable news network during prime time, what you're getting is a narrative. You're getting stories, you're getting anecdotes that are geared toward that audience. And it's the same on CNN as it is on Fox, as it is on MSNBC or CNBC. They are giving you a narrative. Very rarely, if ever, are they giving you, here's the data. And I go back to the example of this allegation that people are allowed to shoplift in San Francisco up to $950. That comes from, in 2014, a proposition was passed in California that made shoplifting a misdemeanor for anything under $950. Okay, so there is a basis, but then there is now 7 years of data that says that did not increase the level of shoplifting crime in the state. And so, no, you can't go into San Francisco or anywhere else in California and just take things without having a fear of being arrested. So, you can't. It's hard to tell a 5-year-old to go find the data, but there are
and a 70-year-old.
Or exactly right.
I mean, I'm thinking about my own father-in-law who absolutely believes that you can go into a store in San Francisco and shoplift and not get arrested. I mean, he's in his mid 70s. Nothing that I tell him could change that he believes that.
And yet there are at least two hardcore research results that show otherwise. And so when in this conversation that I was engaged in, I had heard this, but I didn't know how to respond. So I just picked up my phone. Literally in 15 seconds, I had the research in front of me.
So let's pause there. How did you do that? Let's put you up against my father-in-law. If he Googles something, I don't know where he would end up, but you get onto your phone and you Google, and how did you navigate through to a source?
So it's actually very simple. Add the term research or data to any search. Or of course, I also use Google Scholar, which I don't, isn't, I don't necessarily think everybody should use Google Scholar, but that does now eliminate anything that isn't peer reviewed. That doesn't necessarily mean that that you've completely cleared yourself of the sewer, but you've increased the likelihood that what you're finding is going to be of value and meaningful.
It's a start.
And then you can read it and draw your own conclusions. Is this is this research? And it's not, my dad just passed a year ago, and he had kind of gotten into the same habit of just sort of one source accepting it. And he's a PhD. But it's easy to fall into that trap. When we get to dealing with that with children, again, I think there are simple lessons that we can teach about the importance of data, the importance of understanding the bigger picture tracked over a long period of time versus the anecdote and the narrative. And if you're doing family home evening, do one on that. And it's not that hard to get it to the level where you can use examples that are understandable to that 6-year-old or the 75-year-old or anybody in between. It doesn't need to be this highfalutin academic conversation, but it's a concept that is easily grasped. And you can do something as simple as tell a story to your children that to be false, that they will know to be false, and use that as the jumping off point to what a narrative is, what anecdotal information is, versus having a conversation about the bigger picture and getting into what the source is and that kind of thing. It's not that hard. It ought to be part of every family conversation.
Do you think that this media illiteracy and laziness, really, in terms of vetting sources, compounded, or do you think created the QAnon phenomenon?
Both. There's no doubt that QAnon is the extreme example of someone or someone's taking advantage of the distribution channel. It's free. It's free, and so anybody can do it. And that individual or individuals hooked onto a narrative that and the other and so then on the other end of it, you have people who are always going to fall for the latest conspiracy theory because it easily explains things that are inexplicable. We want simple explanations, and usually nothing is simple. But QAnon gives us simple explanations to complex and difficult and uncomfortable circumstances. So QAnon in that form couldn't have existed in 1980. It would have, I get just today I got delivered in our mail, not my choice, the Epic Times. I don't know if you all know what that is.
Oh no, I do.
Okay, so
yes,
but it comes to my comes to my
I'm glad
house.
we're going to talk about this. Yeah.
So but it's far more that they had someone's printing that. Falun Gong and the people behind with the money are printing that and delivering it. That's expensive, but you can put out the same information essentially for free through this amazing distribution network called the World Wide Web, and that has changed. That is just magnified in an infinite way the opportunity for mischief. And so, yes, QAnon is an extreme example of, and unfortunately, and again, there's data to back this up. People are far more likely to believe false information than they are to believe the truth, because it's usually more interesting. It usually fits into a more conveniently into a narrative. It fits more conveniently into their pre-existing bias. And so it's much easier to spread falsehoods than it is to spread the truth, because it's more fun for people. It's more interesting. It fits their desires much more cleanly.
You know, I use, for that example, I use Sasquatch, and it's more interesting and more fun for a young person. You know, I don't think it's popular anymore, but, you know, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, it was. And it's more interesting to try to tell stories about it existing than it is to say it doesn't exist. There's zero evidence and zero data that really could support, you know, such a mythical creature. But it's more fun to, you know, pretend there is
Loch Ness,
or anything. Loch Ness.
You know, but here's so you and I can, and you're not nearly as old as I, but you and I can talk about Sasquatch and Loch Ness. But today there are 1 million Sasquatches and Loch Nesses out there. You know, there used to be, you know, it took real effort to get these things to catch and for people to spread. Now it's easy. And, you know, I use the example of, if you have 100 followers on your Facebook page and you assume that you post one thing, if all of your followers have 100 and so on, what's the math to get from 1 to 1 million by going 100 times 100 times 100? 3 steps.
Right. That's profound. That is profound. So as we think about moving forward into the future, and I think what we are trying to emphasize is this is serious. This is, you know, not just we're having an episode. We actually want to help society, and we want to help our children and our parents and grandparents. So how do you envision the future and moving, because we will only be trolled with more data. There's not a future of less data. There's a future of more data and information. How do you envision the future? The future that we want to create.
Okay, so the first thing I was going to say is I'm not particularly optimistic.
I know. I saw that. I saw the lack of optimism in your expression, but that's okay.
I hate to say that, but
start there.
I'm not optimistic because it's difficult, and I think it's going to take not one but many real life crises that can be traced back to this phenomenon before. And it's human nature. It's what we do. We wait until the disaster, and then we decide we're going to maybe take some kind of action. And the disasters, I fear, are coming. And I think they are already here. I think COVID provides us a perfect example of how many people have died or will die because of the misinformation that the internet allowed to be propagated about COVID. Hundreds of thousands? How many more? And so So, but even if we're not prepared at this point to recognize what it is. I think, Gary, you brought it up, and I think it's the answer. One of the things that I truly love about Mormonism is the focus on the family, and the understanding that that's the unit here. Now, you can define family, as far as I'm concerned, however you want. That's the main difference that I would come to this with. But that's where these things need to be worked out and discussed and taught and embraced as a value. And we have to start with the 2-year-old, and it doesn't have to be, we don't have to scare them. That's not the point. But there is, and particularly if you start at that age, it becomes part of who they are. You're not trying to go back in and reinvent a person. Because by the time you get to a certain age, the likelihood that you're going to embrace changes, it gets less and less over time. So I think, I'm doing what I can. You're doing what you can. I think that's important. I wrote 52 columns about news literacy in my newspaper. I don't know if it changed anybody's mind. I don't, to a certain degree, I'm not sure I care, because I'm doing what I can do. Mm-hmm. I teach a course. I put media literacy into, in fact, I've submitted a proposal that has been accepted at College of Eastern Idaho to create and stand up a course in media literacy that they were going to require of all sophomores. So there's a step forward. That's something. That's another, 1,000 students that are going to get exposed to media literacy that might not have otherwise. So I think we all need to embrace it. We all need to do what we can, and then we need to buckle up, because there are certain things that we can't change. But I just, start with the family, start in school. Media literacy ought to be part of every class. There ought to be 1 week of media literacy in every class. I don't care if it's PE or a science class or English, but there's a role in those courses for media literacy, and I think they need to be part of our curriculum. Forget about critical race theory. Let's get media literacy into our schools. Let's get and start young.
So a sensitive component of this that I want to ask you, and it relates to some of my viewers who are afraid of critical thinking. They're afraid of what it might reveal to them, because inevitably what will happen with critically thinking and vetting a source is it does, for those who are very tied to their religion, it does begin to unravel what you believed about the founders of your religion. I mean, this will go right to the core of Christianity and cause questions to be asked critically from critical scholarship. Did Jesus really even exist? And so it kind of unravels what we think, or is the reason we believe a certain way. And this isn't just religion, but it even unravels a little bit about what we were taught to believe about our founding fathers, right? Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, that when you begin to critically explore data and information, you begin to realize, oh, maybe our founding forefathers were not perfect. And our church forefathers were not perfect. Many of what our church forefathers have written are made up, or fairy tale, or myth. And so that's a core tenet that really scares people that I know anyway, who need this journey. They need critical thinking in their life. They need to teach their children, because their children remain unvaccinated, right? But they're afraid of what it might mean for their testimony. What do you think?
That's very scary stuff.
Yeah.
The first thing we have to do is acknowledge that fear is legitimate and real. It's not trivial at all. And there are people who want to trivialize that, who want to, oh, come on. No, that's hard. And so I think the first thing we need to do is embrace the understanding that process is hard for everybody. Now, I was brought up in a home where even though my dad was three-time bishop, we still had these very open conversations. And I was sort of, that's kind of, but the price they paid is that I won't get into my siblings, but not all of us hung in there. And some of that was because we were taught to kind of do the deep dive. But I think the question is, and I you can edit this out later, but the South, the whole issue of the South and the Confederacy is based on mythology. And how long do you want to live, living your life based on mythology? I think,
Right.
and not everybody is going to be willing to accept it, but that's what it comes down to, is the whole idea of the Confederacy, and that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. There's a mythology that is, we see it whenever they want to take down a Confederate statue. They want to go back and reinvent and remythologize that whole part of our history. And here's the thing: we don't become lesser because we understand our roots. We are
Hmm.
the founding fathers, I don't think, become lesser because we understand that they were flawed. I mean, all you have to do is read the Constitution and understand that certain human beings were only two-thirds of a person to get that.
Right.
It was a flawed process. I mean, one of the real problems that a lot of my Mormon friends and have is the belief that the Constitution is an inspired document. Does that mean
Hmm.
so do we have to accept it that it was perfect? No, because part of what was included in that inspired document was the ability to amend it. That
Right.
Come
Right.
on, that's that they understood that they were doing the best they could. So, um, what I want to do is just sort of embrace people who are afraid and say,
Yeah.
I get it, I totally get it, but
Hmm.
but trust me, there's an other side where there is peace, where there
Hmm.
is, where you're going to be better for it. And that doesn't mean that on the other side you're going to leave the church, or you're going to leave Christianity, or you're going to become a Democrat, or whatever, horrible outcome might be perceived as that's what's awaiting you. I have a lot of friends who, I'll tell you a quick story, and again, you can edit this out. But so once during a, a Temple Recommend interview with my bishop, this was toward the end of my process. He asked me the questions, and one of the questions, of course, is, "Do you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet?" And I said, "I have a lot of questions." And here's what the wise bishop said to me: "So do I." And he moved on. How great an answer was that?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think the whole, we just need to embrace the idea that being that certitude, which is the self um, the self belief that we have it all figured out, is actually deeply harmful, and it's okay to not know everything, and it's okay to embrace that understanding, and there is a wealth of 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 living that comes out of understanding that opens up whole new opportunities for us.
I love it. And I would just add that um, institutions and organizations like governments and religions that help create a structure around a society um, are shaped by us. We will shape religions, churches, political parties ourselves, and whether we like it or not, the data and truth will win at the end. right? So for example, with COVID, the people who are not getting sick today and ending up in the ICUs most likely had a vaccine. So critical thinking, and I'm being hopeful here, critical thinking and vetting data is will be the winner at the end of the day. And so I think one of the ways that a spiritually minded person can move into this paradigm and into this worldview is to recognize that through data and through critical thinking, we can shape a better future. We will be able to shape a better religious organization or a better political party or better government. Um, and so there's a lot of hope, and it's okay to let the past remain in the past, learn from it honestly through intellectual honesty, and then shape what the future is going to look like, because we'll determine what that is.
And I'll just add one thing. The process of doing that doesn't destroy those institutions. It makes them better. So,
Makes
the process of really understanding how our country was formed and what our true history is makes us better, not it doesn't destroy us. Understanding the true history of religions and societies and cultures makes us stronger, not it doesn't destroy those institutions unless they need to be destroyed, and sometimes they do. I mean, if there's the Nazi regime needed to be destroyed. Okay,
mm-hmm.
that's not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about we can improve these things, but it's I think there's a fear that somehow questioning something is a desire to see it destroyed, and that's not the end game. That's not the objective.
We can evolve, and that's the hope that I have. So thank you, Roger, for taking time. Like I've told your son Brad, there is a possibility that viewers will request to hear from you again, and I hope that we can have you on the show again.
Assuming that I haven't turned everybody off, I'd be happy to anytime.
No, I think I think the opposite will be true. So thank you for your time, Roger.
Thanks, Gary.